So our first speaker, and I've wrestled with an introduction here, Thea Halo. Every great historical event eventually finds the voice that will communicate the gravity, the profundity, and the power of that event. Thea Halo's voice is the voice that we associate, I associate, many of you associate with the terrible events of those years. It's a voice of humanity, of wisdom. It's an authentic voice. It's a clear voice. It's a profound voice. She produced a book, a memoir, that is an icon, really, of genocide literature. And so it's my great pleasure to bring Thea Halo to the lectern. Thank you.
Thank you all. I'm very happy to be here. My paper is called From the Balkans to Anatolia, Pogroms to Genocide. And I just want to make a note about Anatolia, the word Anatolia. This is a Greek word that means east or where the sun rises. Some people call the Greeks that lived in Anatolia, which was Asia Minor, by the way. It's synonymous with Asia Minor. And the Turks still use this word Anatolia today. So when I refer to the Anatolia Greeks, I'm talking about the Greeks who lived in Anatolia, in Asia Minor Anatolia. There have been many theories as to why the Greeks of the Ottoman Empire were targeted for extermination by the Committee of Union and Progress, popularly known as the Young Turks, and subsequently by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. Some of the theories sound more like excuses than fact-based analysis. They include the Balkan Wars, fear of Greek irredentism, and the Greco-Turkish War of 1920 to 1922. Some have even claimed the Greeks were protected due to familial ties between Greece's King Constantine and his brother-in-law, German Kaiser Wilhelm II, an Ottoman ally. In today's Islamophobic atmosphere, blaming Islam for the genocide of the empire's Christian populations is also on the menu. An examination of primary source documents, however, reveal a contingency plan to exterminate the Christians was made long before any of the aforementioned events had occurred. Evidence also suggests that Young Turk insecurities and ineptitude played a part in their genocidal policies. After their successful revolution, the Young Turks won a mere 60 of the 275 seats in the parliamentary elections. 60 seats assured a leadership role for the Young Turks, but it was far from a majority, and the support they must have received as their due reward. The proclamation demanding a return of the constitution that Abdulhamid II had prorogued soon after his ascent to the throne in 1876, and Abdulhamid's subsequent deposition seemed noble. Future problems were assured, however, unless the Young Turks had the patience, intelligence, restraint, ability to govern, and a long-term vision that would encourage trust after centuries of abuse. They would also need to accept the possibility of defeat in a free election, along with the possibility that one or more of the minorities, even a Christian or a Jew, might one day lead the government. The Young Turks would prove they had none of the qualities needed for governing a multi-ethnic empire while professing to make progressive changes. Many saw the July 1908 speech in Liberty Square, Salonika by Young Turk Enver Pasha as inspiring and eloquent. Enver declared, "Today, arbitrary government has disappeared. We are all brothers. There are no longer in Turkey Bulgarians, Greeks, Serbians, Romanians, Muslims, Jews. Under the same blue sky, we are all proud to be Ottomans." End quote. The jubilation in all quarters of the empire was palpable, even in Europe, including Greece. In Turkey, Greeks, Turks, Armenians, and Jews gathered in droves at the port in Constantinople to receive the ships of well-wishers with indescribable enthusiasm. The euphoria was also felt by the common people of Turkey, as expressed by a Pontic Greek who had attended the festivities in a port town in the Black Sea. He reported that crowds of Greeks and Turks sang, "Long live the Constitution, justice, unity, long live the people, Greeks and Turks are one." He added, however, this was the poison they secretly fed us, the Constitution. A Greek doctor from Beria in Greece told us, "Too bad for you, we did well under Hamid, we lived well, but you will be destroyed by this Huria," end quote. Indeed, the euphoria would be short-lived. Almost before the ink was dry on the Constitution, the Young Turks would squander all the goodwill they had garnered, including in the Balkans and in Greece, lending credence to those who believed the Constitution was simply a ploy to gain power. The failure to invite Bulgarian representatives to the official dinner at Constantinople reminded Bulgaria of her inferior diplomatic position as a vassal state. Knowing the Young Turks were weak, Bulgaria declared her independence on October 5, 1908. This was followed by a growing demand from Bosnia and Herzegovina for their own constitution, which gave Emperor Franz Joseph the excuse to annex Bosnia and Herzegovina. For nearly a century, Greece's Megali idea of reviving the Roman Byzantine Empire and one day recapturing lost lands where many Greeks still lived had long been a goal. However, when Crete also moved to throw off Ottoman suzerainty with her October 7, 1908 declaration to unite with Greece, Greece failed to act. At the time, Greece was more interested in good relations with the Ottomans than she was in reclaiming ancient territories, even though most of the powers seemed resigned to allow the union, and Germany and Austria actively approved it. This goodwill gesture by Greece was wasted on the Young Turks, who called for a boycott of Greek shipping, thereby crippling Greece's shipping industry, which added to her already difficult general economy. As early as June 24, 1909, German Ambassador Hans Freiherr von Wangenheim reported that random murders took place in Paedonia, Crete, and Xanthia, Thrace, and that the Young Turks had already decided to wage a war of extermination against the Christians of the empire, and that the murders and the rude treatment of the Patriarch were part and parcel of that decision. The Young Turks had also abandoned their professed brotherly love policy for a more onerous, nationalistic policy that would become Turkey for the Turks. Terming it Ottomanization, the Young Turks planned to Turkify the multi-ethnic Christians, or as British ambassador to the port, Gerald Lothar expressed it, pounding the non-Turkish elements into the Turkish mortar. January 1910 began with public disillusionment, even in Anatolia, not just from the Christian populations, but with the great majority of Muslim citizens and officials as well. In the province of Trabzon, Austrian consul Moritz reported that inexperienced Young Turk appointees replaced experienced civil servants who did nothing but make brash appearances and exploit official desires. Both the economy and public safety suffered and was worse than before the revolution. Repeated robber raids and revenge attacks took place around the province. The police force were useless. With chaos in all quarters due to Young Turk ineptitude, it was no wonder that intimidation and corruption rather than promised reforms became the Young Turks' calling card. At a secret conclave at Salonika in 1910, Talat Bey, later Pasha, and Finance Minister Kavit Bey gave speeches concerning the Ottomanization of the Christian populations, during which a vote was taken to opt for either deportation or massacre. Austrian, French, and British observers reached similar conclusions that recourse to violence was most likely if peaceful efforts to achieve the unity of Turkey met with failure. Their assessment was in line with Wangenheim's 1909 report. The Young Turks' intention to move Muslims into the Balkans from lost provinces such as Bosnia-Herzegovina and from other unrelated areas in order to Ottomanize and neutralize the Christians of Macedonia was one of the first outward signs of their change of policy. or perhaps the first outward sign of their hidden agenda. Acting on the principle that Muslims were a national rather than a religious resource, and that Muslims and even Jews could be used to colonize Macedonia to increase the population of non-Christians, by November 1910, the CUP began to put their relocation policies into action. Quote, in Kosovo and Skopje, new arrivals took over common lands and drove out Christian peasants. Bulgarian and Macedonian groups objected bitterly, but could do nothing except bide their time until they got their chance for revenge, end quote. The CUP plan was accompanied by murders, massacres, and torture. The strategy was to cut off the head of the Christian communities, so to speak, by first concentrating on the notables all over Macedonia, to ensure the aggrieved citizens had no one to lead them. U.S. Consul General George Horton, who was stationed in Salonika in 1910, added, quote, a favorite place for shooting these people was at their doorsteps at the moment of their return home. It became evident that the Turkish government, in order to gain control of the territory, was bent on the extermination of the non-Muslim leaders, end quote. The policy was then extended to people of less importance. Horton wrote in his diary on December 11, 1910, quote, wholesale arrests in some of the towns, all the prominent citizens being thrown into jail together. Series of assassinations of chiefs of communities in broad day in the streets, 50 prominent Bulgarians thus shot down, and many Greeks. The prisons were bursting with unfortunate people existing in starvation and filth, end quote. When worried women went to the Vali, the Turkish governor, to ask about their men who had disappeared, he answered mockingly, he has probably run away and left you, or he has probably gone to America. But corpses began to be discovered in ravines and gullies, in the mountains and woods. The great powers recognized the excesses of the Young Turks in the Balkans. However, outside condemnation had no effect on the Young Turks' plans or policies. Their brutal policies were miscalculations that would unite longtime Balkan adversaries, Bulgarians, Serbians, Montenegrins, and Greeks. Their policies would also initiate the final stages of the disintegration of the empire. By January 1911, the Marquis of Landau stated that all faith in the new constitutional system in Turkey had utterly collapsed. In March of 1911, the Austrian consul at Smyrna reported that the parliamentary elections called by the CUP were done in an extremely corrupt and illegal manner. Britain and other great powers had also been following the Turks' orgies, the Young Turks' orgies of abuse, as they were called. With Italian troops in Tripoli and the Dodecanese, the Albanians and Albania's declaration of autonomy, pressure on the Young Turks grew at home. In July of 1912, the Young Turks were finally forced out of office by a hostile army and replaced by the Liberal Union Party. On October 1, 1912, Prime Minister of Greece, Eleftherios Venizelos, invited the Cretan delegates to the Greek Parliament, parliamentary session, which made Crete's long sought-after union with Greece a given. 7 days later, on October 8, 1912, Montenegro declared war on the Ottoman Empire. And on October 17, Bulgaria, Serbia, and Greece followed suit, thus commencing the First Balkan War of 1912 to 1913. Albania took the opportunity to declare her independence from the empire and was recognized as an independent state on November 28, 1912. Ottoman losses in the First Balkan War stripped the empire of all its European territories, after which the Young Turks staged a coup d'etat against the Liberal Union Party, a coup that included the assassination of the Liberal Union's Minister of Navy, Nassim Pasha. This coup brought the CUP back to power and marked the end of any successful challenge to Young Turk rule until after World War I. It also marked the end of any possibility of curtailing Germany's hold over what was left of the empire, as Talat and Enver were firmly committed to Germany's vision at least the part they thought they understood. Wengenheim's 1909 assertion of the Young Turks' plan of extermination of Christian minorities beginning in Anatolia confirmed that it was only a matter of time before worse tactics would be used in Anatolia. By 1912, the Young Turks were already inducting Ottoman Greeks into labor battalions or sending them directly to the front in the Balkans, ensuring their demise. During the Second Balkan War of 1913, the Ottomans reclaimed the city of Adrianople and all of eastern Thrace. The Greeks of Thrace were then brutalized, raped, robbed, and even murdered, forcing survivors to abandon their homes. As to protection of the Greeks in Turkey because of royal ties, U.S. Consul General George Horton, who was stationed in Smyrna from 1911 to 1917, and again from May 1919 to September 1922, declared the treatment of the indigenous Greeks, who were known as Raya, or more offensively as Peor, infidels. He wrote, quote, "The most frightful victims of Turkish and German malignancy were the Rayas or Greeks under Ottoman sovereignty. These were massacred, robbed, driven out of their homes, ravaged, or were drafted into the army and set to digging trenches and other work of that nature, which without food or clothing, until many of them died of starvation and exposure." In the spring of 1914, the Young Turks began their backup plan to Turkify the empire by exterminating the Christian populations of Anatolia, starting with the Greeks. As Christians, the Assyrians and Armenians would later share the same fate. Horton reported that in the spring of 1914, before the commencement of the Great War, the Aegean coast Greeks were demonized to induce the Turkish population to destroy them. Quote, "Violent and inflammatory articles in the Turkish newspapers appeared unexpectedly and without cause, so evidently inspired by the authorities. Cheap lithographs, executed in the clumsiest and most primitive manner, represented Greeks cutting up Turkish babies or ripping open pregnant Muslim women, and various purely imaginary scenes, founded on no actual events or even accusations elsewhere made. These were hung in the mosques and schools and set the Turks to killing." End quote. Morgenthau and Horton believed that the subsequent attacks against the Greeks along the western coast of Anatolia were instigated by Germany. In the 1880s, Germany had developed commercial interest in Anatolia. Numerous articles in the German press defending attacks on Armenians by then Sultan Abdulhamid revealed a disturbing German willingness to support violent Ottoman policies towards its Christian subjects. At the beginning of 1915, the Deutsche Palästina Bank circulated pamphlets in Turkish in eastern Anatolia, exciting the fanaticism of the Muslims, recommending hatred of the Christians, and recommending cessation of all commercial relations with them, end quote. German propagandist Alfons Suznitsky, writing in 1917, spread propaganda against Armenians and Greeks, claiming, quote, "usury and the exploitation of foreign protection contributed to the economic ascendancy of these groups," end quote. Suznitsky went so far as to advocate the exclusion of Armenians and Greeks for being under British and French influence, then proposed using Ottoman Jews, Arabs, and Dome, Jewish converts to Islam, in their place, since, according to Suznitsky, Turks lacked the racial aptitude for trade. Suznitsky and others also reminded readers of the Ottoman-Turkish need for German aid. German historian Hilmar Kaiser asserts that this German World War I propaganda was addressed to both Ottoman and German audiences, and the mass murder of Armenians had opened up new opportunities for German trade and investment. This held true for the mass murder and displacement of the indigenous Greeks and Assyrians as well. The Times headline noted, "Extermination of Greeks in Turkey, a German plot disclosed." German engineering of the genocidal policies against the Anatolian Greeks was widely recognized. When German ambassador to Turkey, Count Metternich, attempted to intervene on behalf of the Christians in 1917, an outraged Enver Pasha and German military authorities in Constantinople demanded he be recalled by the Kaiser, claiming intervening in favor of the Christians wounded the amour propre of the Turks and badly served German interests. This should put to rest the notion that King Constantine's familial connection with the German Kaiser protected the Anatolian Greeks. U.S. ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, Henry Morgan Dorsini, concluded, because the world did not protest against these deportations, the Turks afterwards decided to apply the same methods on a larger scale, not only to the Greeks, but to the Armenians, Syrians, Nestorians, and others of its subject peoples. In fact, Bedri Bey, the prefect of police at Constantinople, himself told one of my secretaries that the Turks had expelled the Greeks so successfully that they had decided to apply the same methods to all the other races in the empire. Deportation and induction into labor battalions in wartime period was then extended to the other races, as Morgenthau called them, Assyrians, Armenians, and Pontic Greeks. Some 250,000 inducted into the labor battalions perished from hunger and deprivation in the wartime period alone. Some were simply murdered. While some blame the Islamic religion as a motivating force for the genocide, one must remember that Germany, which sanctioned and even encouraged the mistreatment of the Ottoman Christians, was mainly a Christian nation. And by all accounts, the Young Turks were marginally religious, and not all of the Young Turk leaders and ideologues were Muslims. This is not to say that the Young Turks didn't use religion to their advantage. Samuel Raphael Cohen, aka Tekin Alp, was one of the founders of Turkish nationalism and one of the biggest advocates of pan-Turkism and pan-Turanianism. Tekin Alp candidly admitted that religion was used by the Young Turks as an easy tool to incite the uneducated masses against what was proffered as a common enemy. Quote, they realized only too clearly that the still abstract ideals of nationalism could not be expected to attract the masses, the lower classes, composed of uneducated and illiterate people. It was found more expedient to reach these classes under the flag of religion, end quote. The Islam of the Arabs, however, which had been adopted by the Turks, could not satisfy the political agenda of the Young Turks. Alp explained, quote, because it is written in the Quran that Islam knows no nationalities, but only believers, they maintain that the Turks cannot interpret the Quran in the same manner as the Arabs. Their idea of God is also different, end quote. In essence, the Young Turks had to reinterpret Islam and perhaps even create their own God to support their agenda. George Horton believed that the economic and educational superiority of the Christian populations was the most important factor in pushing the Young Turks towards the extermination of their Christian subjects. Had the Young Turks kept their campaign promise of justice, equality, fraternity, with a truly multicultural, multi-religious federation, Horton believed the worker-bees, the Christians, would have taken over the hive, and the Young Turks knew it. He wrote, quote, the weakness of the conception was that in an equal, friendly rivalry, the Christians would speedily have outstripped the Ottomans, who would soon have found themselves in a subordinate position commercially, industrially, and economically. They are jealous of the Christians, whom they regard as thriving at their expense. I have heard Turkish politicians make speeches at Salonika, in which they affirm that if the Christians were exterminated and driven out, the Turks would of sheer necessity progress and develop schools, commerce, and industry. Then followed the great massacres, end quote. Many others independently shared Horton's view. Turkish insecurity was not limited to Christian superiority, however, but Arab superiority as well. The Young Turks were determined to eliminate all traces of the superior Arab culture in the matter of religion and language. Christian Arabs were also massacred. Quote, Jamal Pasha hanged or deported hundreds of the Arab leaders with their families and some 80,000 Christian Arabs of Lebanon have been deliberately starved to death, while the mortality among Arab divisions sent to the frigid highlands of Armenia must have been considerable, end quote. A European essay after the Balkan Wars described for Tekinalp, quote, the causes of the complete overthrow of those Turkish armies, which were once the wonder and terror of the old world, end quote. It concluded that Turkish soldiers had lost touch with their ancient heroes. By 1912, a plan was developed to create education centers and lectures to instill in the Turkish public a national consciousness to put them in touch with those ancient heroes. By opening up the Ottoman territories to Germany, the Young Turks hoped to remedy the limitations in the fields of both education and commerce. And although much is made of Greece's Megali idea, the Young Turks had their own Megali idea. Referring to the period after the Balkan Wars, Tekinalp described the mindset of the Young Turk leaders as, quote, the longing of the Turkish nation for independence in their own country, end quote. The Turkish nation turned aside its gaze from the lost territories in the Balkans and looked instead upon Turania to expand the Turkish Empire eastward where the other Turkish elements lived. This would necessitate the obliteration of all non-Turkish elements who could not be forced to assimilate. This ideology became the driving force that had not only set the stage for genocide, but for entry into the First World War. With the end of the First World War, Greek troops landed at Smyrna as per the Treaty of Sevres on May 5, 1919. On May 19, 1919, Mustafa Kemal, described as an ethno-nationalist extremist, arrived at Samsun with the formidable new position and title of Inspector General, and subsequently as head of the emerging nationalist movement. Kemal was sent by the Sultan to disarm the Turkish rebels per the Treaty of Mudros. However, Kemal immediately set to work arranging mass demonstrations to protest the landing of Hellenic troops at Smyrna 4 days earlier. In March of 1920, 7 months before the Greco-Turkish War, Kemal was already solidifying its official non-Christian agenda when he declared non-Muslims should not be allowed to participate in elections. Quote, Christians were not only excluded from the elections, they became targets for massacres. Ebu Bekir Hassim Teperan, who served as a governor general of the Sivas province for part of 1919, said the massacres were so horrible that he could not bear to report them, referring to the atrocities against Greeks in the Black Sea region. In addition, the entire population of Greek males residing in the coastal villages and towns were deported. The massacres occurred on such a scale that they came up for discussion at one of the National Assembly's closed sessions, end quote. In fact, Mustafa Kemal's nationalist activities and reformations were not original. His ideology was in keeping with Young Turk ideology, including the cleansing of the Turkish language of foreign words and the empire of what they called foreign elements. In many instances, Kemal simply adopted and carried out the incomplete plans and actions of the Young Turks, including the genocide of the Pontic Greeks, begun by the Young Turks in 1915. Finally, the massacres at Smyrna and the exchange of population of 1923. Many Young Turks had joined Kemal in his efforts. Scholar Mark Levine confirms the assessments of Horton and others with an added insight. He writes, by ridding themselves of the Armenians, Greeks, or any other group that stood in their way, Turkish nationalists were attempting to prove how they could clarify, purify, and ultimately unify a polity and society so that it could succeed on its own, albeit Western-oriented terms. This, of course, was the ultimate paradox. The CUP committed genocide in order to transform the residual empire into a streamlined, homogeneous nation-state on the European model. Once the CUP had started the process, the Kemalists, freed from any direct European pressure by the 1918 defeat and capitulation of Germany, went on to complete it, achieving what nobody believed possible, the reassertion of independence and sovereignty via an exterminatory war of national liberation, end quote. Up to 1.2 million Greeks under Ottoman rule were victims of the genocide. 353,000 were Pontic Greeks. 275,000 Assyrians perished, over half their population, and some put Armenian losses at 1.5 million. Inasmuch, over 3 million Christians of the Ottoman Empire were victims of this genocide between 1913 and 1923. Although denial is often described as the final killer, I disagree. I believe silence is the final killer, as it renders the victims of genocide invisible as if they never existed. Until recently, that silence rendered the Pontic Greeks and Assyrians invisible. Elie Wiesel describes denial as a double killing, as it also murders the memory of the crime. But he also reminds us that to remain silent or indifferent is the greatest sin. Thank you.